All right. So good morning, everyone. Um, Welcome again. And before I introduce our speaker this morning, I want to just remind you all about the four polls that will launch throughout the hour. Make sure to respond to those polls. And for the CPE, your credit for CPE. Also, throughout the presentation, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hands. You can send those through chat to me, or even directly to Dustin. Um, and we'll take them as they come in. So let's introduce our speaker this morning. We have Dustin Nord with us, who is the director of CBIA's Foundation for Economic Growth and Opportunity, which is a nonprofit focused on long-term economic growth strategies in Connecticut. Dustin leads the foundation's efforts to drive economic competitiveness through implementation of Opportunity Connecticut, which is the foundation's economic action plan. Prior to joining the CBIA Foundation, Nord was a senior research associate at Advanced Connecticut, or Advanced CT, the economic development organization for the state of Connecticut. There, he conducted research on the Connecticut's economy, focusing also on policy research related to taxation, housing, and occupational licensing. Dustin also holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Villanova. So I'd like to turn it over to you, Dustin. The room is yours.
Thank you, April. Thank you, and thanks for having me this morning. Excited to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. What I'd like to do this morning is just run through some of some of the work that we've done in terms of looking at, I think a lot of this is probably familiar to you all in terms of what's actually in the most recent, One Big Beautiful Bill budget package. But what I wanted to do was talk about it in the context of the Connecticut economy, what it means for Connecticut, what it means for our budget, what it means for the overall state. And then also try to sprinkle in some of the specific things we're seeing in the economy right now that we want to be paying attention to. And then ultimately, hopefully, be able to inform what we're doing in the long run in the state. So I'm just going to share my screen here. All set, April? Can you see that? Cool. All right. As many of you know, Paz, we're about a month and a half into since we signed the bill, and I think there's been a lot of ink spilled over what's in it and what we're trying to do here. And again, a lot of this we did cover a little bit. I know that you all have covered a lot in your roles. We covered in a webinar, so what we're going through right now has to do a little bit with what that webinar was that we hosted a couple of weeks ago. But again, it's still relevant, and some things have been updated as we've gone along in the last couple of weeks. Now, obviously, what we're looking at in terms of the economic impact of the bill is on the benefit side. Obviously, we're looking at the stimulus factors that exist within the bill, and on the the negative side, we're looking at some of the drags, some of the things that will ultimately cut back on spending, cut back on economic activity, and what that looks like specifically in Connecticut. So on the benefit side, obviously, we're looking first at tax cuts. We're looking at business investment incentives, and we're looking at federal investments in industry. And on the drag side, we're looking primarily at benefits cuts. We're looking at reduced spending on those benefits. We're looking at higher borrowing costs. And we're looking at the overall budget uncertainty that exists for the state as a result of these changes. Now, we're going to get into it, but there's some changes that obviously there's some nuance as a result of how the bill is written in terms of when these things are going to take effect, and that's going to impact some of our expectations there. So in terms of the two, I would argue, sort of biggest and most nonpartisan projections that I've seen with respect to the overall economic impact of the bill are from CBO and the Yale Budget Lab, two pretty pristine sources for that information. And in both cases, I think what they show in some ways agrees and in some ways disagrees. So on the CBO side, they're looking at about a 0.5% increase on average over 10 years to GDP growth. So it not insubstantial. You're talking about, $1,000 or so in the pockets of, the average American in terms of GDP per capita. So that is a decent sized chunk, but it's not a boom. I think that one thing you'll see in agreements in terms of the broader economic impact of this bill is that it's not a massive boom. It is a relatively modest increase in economic activity. There are some projections that do suggest a boom, but I'd say the more moderate ones that have taken into account more factors and tried to model different things into their assumptions suggest a kind of smaller effect, but nonetheless a positive one over the long term. With the big variable being what the crowd out effect is. So the crowd out just being what is the impact on interest rates? If those interest rates are getting higher, what does that mean for investment? What does that mean for budgets? And ultimately, if there's higher interest rates, that if this bill causes higher interest rates, it'll limit its obvious growth impact. And if it doesn't increase interest rates as much as some people think, then it'll have a much larger impact. CBO is estimating a much smaller crowd out effect, whereas the Yale Budget Lab is looking at potentially a much larger one. On the CBO side, they were expecting about a 14 basis point increase in baseline interest rates, whereas the Yale Budget Lab was looking at more closer to zero point 0.5. So it's definitely a big difference in terms of how they're viewing that. But on the Yale Budget Lab, I think you get a good sense of what I think is a good measure, which is that a lot of the potential impact is in the near term. And over the long term, we're looking at that's where we're looking at deficits. That's where we're looking at interest rates. That's where the challenges come in is over the longer span. In the near term, we might expect a larger stimulus relative. So we're looking at a 0.5% average or a 0.2% average. Most of that is coming in the first 2 years. And obviously, this has to do with timing, and I can get into the specifics as to which one each of these pieces are ultimately taking effect. But a lot of the different pieces in terms of, the stimulus is happening immediately in the bill. So a lot of the tax cuts, a lot of the new investments are at least on paper available immediately. Some of them are obviously awaiting further guidance. So we don't know how the money is going to be spent in certain instances, but ultimately that is happening sooner, whereas the large cuts, which are primarily to things like Medicaid and SNAP, are happening a couple years down the road. And so what the impact of those types of cuts will be remains to be seen. So a lot of this is front loaded in terms of the benefits. And then I think the other consideration that's important to consider is, and that's hard to model and hard to understand, is how much some of these beneficial changes ultimately stay within the Connecticut economy versus leak out. And we'll get into some of the specifics of which pieces, I'm looking at and other people are looking at in terms of the Connecticut economy. But if those things are able to be contained within Connecticut, obviously it's much better for the Connecticut economy. If those benefits are mostly accruing to the households, and then those households are, that money is ultimately being spent elsewhere, then obviously Connecticut does not benefit as much. So that's a variable that's very difficult to model. So on the opportunity side, in terms of what we look at in terms of stimulus effects, the big one for Connecticut is the salt cap increase from 10,000 to 40,000. About 11% of households were maxing out the previous salt cap. So that is a large number of households, not a massive number, but at least a decent sized number of households that theoretically could benefit from this increase. That doesn't mean that after this, 11% of households will be getting $40,000, will be up to that next limit. Obviously, there are some people that will not reach this new threshold of 40K. But considering Connecticut's position both as a high income and relatively high tax for state and local taxation, we would expect this type of a change to have a much larger effect in a place like Connecticut and other northeastern states like Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, than in some other states around the country. So this is definitely an area of an opportunity for Connecticut relative to the country overall, where we might be able to accrue a lot more of that economic gain than some of our peers around the country. With the only challenge being that, and I think for the state in terms of our own economic planning and looking ahead, is that it's temporary. It expires after a few years, and what that looks like for us means that is essentially a potential large tax increase down the line for some people, depending on how they are planning in terms of planning out their long-term tax plans. And that's definitely a challenge in terms of what that means for the Connecticut economy. Again, going back to that point about it being a front-loaded bill, this is, I think, even in Connecticut specific terms, an even more front-loaded aspect of it, that we have this specific disproportionately impacting Connecticut bill to the benefit for, or disproportionately impacting Connecticut benefit in the near term immediately. It means that it's going to disproportionately impact it when it goes away. And that's obviously a problem for us. On the temporary deduction side, a lot of these are very across the board and not that dissimilar for most of Connecticut relative to the rest of the country. We don't have a dissimilar mix of people that are in tipped occupations or other types of occupations that would suggest that that would be a huge boost relative to other places. But we would expect that this increases the amount of disposable income for people in certain like occupational verticals. Same with things like auto loans. These are after the new Senate bill came out, and it was ultimately pared down to just new vehicles that had pretty tight requirements for American-made standards for those new vehicles. That's definitely limited the broader impact here, and thus I wouldn't expect Connecticut to, if Connecticut has any sort of specific advantage here, it would be small, and we likely wouldn't see anything different relative to the rest of the country. And on the senior side, in terms of the new seniors additional deduction for seniors, Connecticut does have a relatively old population. However, we're not relatively old in terms of the number of seniors. We have one of the oldest workforces in the country, but it's primarily because we have older people of working age. A lot of people, so we're sort of middling in terms of the number of seniors as a proportion of our kind of upper third in terms of states, in terms of the number of seniors in our population. So that particular deduction, again, is slightly good for Connecticut. Obviously, it's good for those individuals, but that is, again, not something that I would expect be a massive boon to Connecticut's economy specifically, although we would expect some level of stimulus as a result. And these are just some additional details, but I feel like for this crowd, a lot of people probably know a lot of this information. So, um, and I think one of the challenges here for what we're hearing from businesses as we go on, and obviously where folks like yourselves come in, is that a lot of this is obviously awaiting further guidance, and there's a lot of uncertainty for businesses. So in terms of where, I think you'll see in almost every single one of these pieces, they're awaiting further IRS guidance, awaiting further IRS guidance, right? I think right now, a lot of people are in a holding pattern in terms of how they're looking to make investments or changes, especially for small businesses, in terms of being able to provide, new benefits, how they might change payment structures for their employees. We were just having a conversation yesterday talking about what the change to overtime rules might mean for how people ultimately decide to pay their employees and what they offer employees and what that might look like. And those are the kinds of distortions to the economy that tax changes like this ultimately make. It's something that economists always get very upset about. They don't like when people do this, when the government makes these kinds of changes, because it creates these inefficiencies in the market where you might be paying now it gives you an incentive to be paying people via tips, or paying people via overtime, or buying a certain type of car, or specifically in this case buying a new car when an economist would tell you that you should buy an old car, right? Like all of these different things that economists don't like to have happen. I would say that these are all things that kind of fall under that category. However, in the context again of the Connecticut economy, it does still mean more money in people's pockets, but it does require that guidance to ultimately come out so that people can plan ahead. Um, on the other big opportunity, I would say, for Connecticut and especially the Northeast, is the changes to R&D expensing and bonus depreciation. We're a pretty investment heavy region in terms of a lot of our economic growth in Connecticut comes from automation, comes from productivity gains, it comes from R&D. If we look at where Connecticut has seen growth over the last 10 years, most of that's in healthcare, but a lot of it, when we look at professional and business services, which is another large vertical for jobs in Connecticut, is in the R&D side, especially on the scientific side. I live in New Haven. The last 10 years for New Haven have been a very good time, specifically because of research and development. And a lot of that is academic, but a lot of it is also on the private side. So having an additional ability to cut down on your tax bill by investing in R&D, I think likely benefits Connecticut simply because we're one of the top 5 states in terms of per capita R&D investment, both not just academic, but also on an industrial side. Um, the same with industrial investment. We're not top 10. I think we're in the middle, somewhere around like 15 in terms of industrial investment per employee. But that kind of investment is still pretty critical to Connecticut's growth. We don't have a super strong population growth metric. The trend there is better than it has been, but still not great. We are ultimately needing greater investment in the state in order to continue economic growth if we want to continue to expand and support the state going forward. And so this type of a change definitely is beneficial to Connecticut. Probably not on that case as disproportionately beneficial for Connecticut, this specifically the bonus depreciation side of it. For example, most of the manufacturing investment in the country over the last 5 years since COVID has been in places like the Mountain West. That's where and maybe in some of the Midwest, that's where you're seeing like the new fabs getting built. That's where the billions of dollars are getting spent, whereas New England has not seen that. So I wouldn't expect this to have necessarily a disproportional impact on Connecticut, but it's still a positive for the economy. And then the pass-through entity benefits, that is another area where I think potentially disproportionate impact on Connecticut, similar to the SALT cap. It's just we have a lot of high-income individuals and that are classified as small businesses or just small businesses that ensuring that continuing to ensure that these benefits are available to those businesses is definitely a positive for our state. So in some ways, this also represents just not going back to the previous status quo, maintaining the current status one as it relates to pass-through entity benefits is definitely to the benefit of Connecticut relative to the country. Um, I think in addition to all of these types of tax changes on the benefit side as well, we're looking at the federal industrial investment. So there are 2 main areas that there was significant amounts of money devoted to industrial investment, and it was in defense and shipbuilding and affordable housing. And so on the defense and shipbuilding side, when we look at, they're looking at $250 million for defense manufacturing training, looking at $450 million for maritime workforce development, supply chain development, right? So Connecticut is one of the places one of the largest in terms of per capita defense contracts. We're top 5 in the country in terms of per capita defense contracts as a huge part of our economy, especially our manufacturing economy in Connecticut. So this type of investment is definitely beneficial for Connecticut. On the shipbuilding side, I believe we're number 2 in terms of shipbuilding as like a size of our economy. And this is spreading out not just to those OEMs like Pratt and to Electric Boat, but also to their supply chain as well. So ultimately, we're still waiting to see how this shakes out and what they're deciding should be spent and where. So it's too early to say that it's definitely going to be a boon for Connecticut, but I would say that on its face, it's definitely a positive, or it's likely a positive, I should say. Um, the other new change that is interesting is the change to the workforce or change the Pell Grants to allow for using Pell Grants for low-income individuals to get access to workforce development training. So these are shorter-term certificate trainings or, shorter-term trainings that don't necessarily mean you're going to college, which is primarily what Pell Grants are for, right? So this is a new opportunity to expand our workforce training, get more people trained up and entering into the labor force in critical industries. Connecticut's had 70, we currently have 77,000 job openings. We've had hovering between 77 and about 90,000 job openings for the last 2 years. We have not been able to fill those jobs. It's one of the biggest things kind of holding back the Connecticut economy when we look at where the challenges are for the state. It's not been a lack of demand for people. It's been the lack of ability to get people in the door working in those jobs. That relates as well to the affordable housing investment that the federal government is making in this bill. The expansion of low-income housing tax credits is again definitely to the benefit of Connecticut. We are one of the worst performing states in terms of housing construction. I wouldn't expect that this is going to change that ranking all that much, but I think considering the acute nature of the housing shortage in Connecticut relative to the country, I think this is potentially a very important change that could really help our state attract some of those talent, attract some of that talent, and retain a lot of talent in the state to fill a lot of those jobs in our key industries. And I did want to say if there's anybody that has questions or if you want to send any questions to me in the chat, feel free to chime in. Be happy to fill in any gaps that I have. If I say something that doesn't make sense, be happy to explain. I did want to stop on opportunity zones for a moment. Opportunity zones are set specific tracks that have been designated within the state to allow for greater investment. Connecticut has done a decent job relative to the country in utilizing this program over the last, since I guess it was 2017 in the TCJA that these became part of the law. Um, so the expansion of these, little more flexibility in this program should allow us to do a better job in terms of facilitating investment in a lot of these zones. So it'll be important for us to, on my side, working with DECD, folks in the research department there, to ensure that we know where these things are, that businesses know where these zones are, so that if they're looking to make those investments, we can make sure that they have an understanding of what this program looks like and how they can take advantage of it. So on the challenges side, when we're looking at what are the things that are ultimately from this bill that we should be looking out for as a drag on the Connecticut economy going forward, I think the two big ones right at the top are reduced federal money flow through Medicaid and SNAP. So these are not cuts that are going to be happening immediately. These are cuts that are going to be happening mostly 2027 and afterwards. But it is sizable in terms of the sheer amount of money. And I think the challenge there that it presents is simply less money flowing through the Connecticut economy, right? So this is money that was covered by the feds, that meant that it was definitely offsetting some spending that we would have had to do on a local level, whether that was from the state, from local government, or from hospital provider or from medical providers. Federal government was obviously offsetting a lot of that. So a $13 billion estimated reduction over 10 years is pretty sizable. That is about, the estimates for how many people will lose coverage is somewhere between 100 and 200,000, depending on ultimately the primary mechanism there being work requirements and how those are implemented, how the uptake goes in terms of are people reporting and how effective is our compliance apparatus for people being able to access those benefits. So there's definitely a lot of uncertainty with how it will impact folks. But that's a pretty major concern. Other things like provider taxes, which is essentially a way of the state to tax our hospitals. That money flows into the state government, but it allows more money to flow back into the hospitals through the Medicaid program at the federal level. That is being pared back as well. Connecticut is we've actually been very good at taking advantage of that program. We pretty much maxed out the amount that we can tax our hospital providers, and thus we've maximized the benefits that they can receive. That is going to be pared back starting in 2027. And so that's going to be something that ultimately the bigger concern is more on I would say, the hospital side in terms of how they backfill some of those potential benefits. The ultimate impact is potentially higher premiums for our employees, higher costs for our hospitals. And that's probably the biggest challenge economically is how do we ultimately this was real money that was in the economy that was provided for our pretty important healthcare sector, and it's not going to be there anymore. So that's definitely a problem. Commonwealth Fund did an analysis of what these cuts would look like. This analysis was done prior to the Senate version coming out, where these were offset by a couple of years. So that, take these estimates with a grain of salt. But they were looking at, the change to Medicaid costing Connecticut specifically just over $1.5 billion per year, and an impact of about 8,200 jobs, right? So that's like a year one impact. That won't, they were initially saying that's 2026. This is obviously more like 2028. Now is how the bill was written. But ultimately, it's not nothing. Those are still fairly small amounts of the Connecticut economy overall. It's north of 300, we're a $375 billion economy. So $1.5 billion sounds like a lot, but it's not massive. But it's still not what you want to see. It's still not a great number. On the SNAP side, for for supplemental nutrition, food stamps, we're looking at a cut that will impact a lot of people. Ultimately, how it impacts the Connecticut side, I think, is more detrimental on the budget side, which we'll get into in a minute. But ultimately, the changes to the SNAP program, who benefits, what you can actually use it on, and how you can take advantage of it, is important. The Commonwealth Fund also have modeled that out. It's a much smaller impact on the state economy, 256 million, 1,200 jobs. But again, all in, you're looking at between those two programs a negative economic impact close to $2 billion and over 9,000 jobs over the span of those 10 years. So that's impacting very early on and ultimately reducing our long-term economic opportunity in those areas. Um, The other piece that I think is important to cover with respect to Connecticut's economy is the clean energy changes. Connecticut has obviously large goals for our ability to decarbonize the grid in Connecticut and broadly in New England. When we look at how Connecticut has actually added renewable energy over the last 10 years, relative to a lot of peers, we've relied heavily on rooftop solar, on residential solar to add new generation capacity on the renewable side. Like something like half of all of the, if not slightly more, of all of the solar that we've added in Connecticut over the last decade has been rooftop solar. And so these types of changes where we're cutting the residential clean energy credits, which will ultimately apply to a lot of solar projects and ultimately cut down on a lot of those types of projects, is definitely a challenge that the state will have to overcome. We have the second highest electricity prices in the country. A lot of that has to do with load demand at specific times of year that we were hoping to impact by changing people's habits as it relates to their home heating, home electricity use, implementing battery storage, those types of things. These changes, while battery wasn't impacted by the change in credits, those are still untouched. It's still a challenge in terms of how we respond to these changes. Again, it probably increases the long run electricity costs in the state as a result. It increases it for a lot of places. Connecticut's definitely not alone, and it's not just unique to New England. But it's something that I'm personally concerned about in terms of how we respond to that challenge. We just rely so heavily on these projects to implement our renewable energy goals, and just like broadly, even outside of renewable energy goals, just energy requirements. We were relying heavily on these types of projects, and now they're not available to us in the same way. And in that energy efficient home improvement credit, again, one of the big challenges for Connecticut when you look at where our energy use happens, the biggest challenge we have is in the wintertime. We rely heavily on oil and natural gas to heat our homes. Improving energy efficiency for homes and commercial businesses was a pretty important component of us being able to limit our energy use in the winter, which should bring down some of our energy costs and reduce demand for our finite gas resources. And this is definitely a headwind to that. And again, similar things here as it relates to clean electricity investment and production, wind energy in the southwest part of the state, or southeast part of the state, I should say, has been an important industry, developing the new wind farms off the coast of Massachusetts and coming out of New London. They're obviously still building those. Those are still under construction. I don't believe that at least the newest ones are meant to, those are still meant to come online on schedule, but there was a hope that we would be able to continue to expand that industry in the southeast part of the state, and now obviously there's a lot of uncertainty there as a result of the changes to our energy policy. I think as well, and like the advanced manufacturing production credit, on wind components, like that being excluded, that's definitely a challenge because at the same time, a lot of those components come from abroad. A lot of the stuff that we use to build wind components is coming from Europe, the Netherlands, Germany specifically. those obviously in the same tariff market that we're talking about at the same time, like not having production credits to be able to potentially onshore some of the production is definitely a challenge for that industry, and that's an important industry for us and for the future. So that is definitely a problem. And I will say on the clean vehicle side, eh, Connecticut again, one thing that is we have not been adopting clean vehicles, zero emission vehicles at the same rate as a lot of our peers, likely in part due to the high electricity prices that we have. This should only continue to inhibit our ability to adopt those EVs in the near term. Um, in terms of one of the other major industries in Connecticut is higher education. And there were a couple of changes that are definitely impacting the state as a result. There were changes to federal borrowing rules, which will definitely limit borrowing. Again, limiting borrowing just means that there's less credit available, which means that there's less money available, which means there's fewer students paying full price or half price or whatever. But that's real money that was flowing into the state. That's obviously going to be curtailed to some extent. So that's one challenge. And then the other thing that's mentioned here is the change. There's actually a slight error up here. The changes to the large endowments won't be up to 21%, it'll be up to 8%. But nonetheless, that 1.4% rate going up to an 8% for people like Yale, which is primarily the only institution that's going to be impacted, is definitely still a challenge, especially for a local economy like New Haven, where they rely heavily on the Yale investment in research and development in the area. That's a major headwind for that local economy and things like biotech. So when we're looking at some of the challenges for certain industries, biotech definitely gets impacted in Connecticut as a result of these changes. Not dissimilar to what you might see in a Boston, where a lot of it is funded by, the likes of Harvard, but it's definitely, I think, probably going to be acutely felt in the New Haven area as a result. And I think finally, the big question mark here is that we touched on it a little bit at the beginning, is what the interest rate pressure is from any additional deficit spending, right? So if the Yale Budget Lab is looking at a 0.6% near-term increase in interest rate, 1.2% long-term, CBO is looking at like a 0.14 increase, so much smaller. This is the open question as to will these larger deficits increase our long run or our long-term borrowing rate? And if they do, what's the ultimate economic impact? Excuse me. That is in Connecticut a challenge, especially on the state budget side, simply because of the large debt load that the state has. So in addition to the state budget pressures that we're going to see from things like Medicaid and SNAP changes, that's we're also looking at a problem of with our large debt, we paid $3.5 billion in debt service payments last year on the I think it's $27.6 billion in bonded debt that the state has. That $3.5 billion represents something around like 15% of the state general fund, which is very large compared to a lot of other states. We pay a lot in debt service. We've done a great job in recent years of limiting our spending growth over that period so that we've limited the need to potentially take on new debt in the future. We limit our borrowing every single year, but nonetheless, any increases in interest rates ultimately crowd out other types of spending that the state would be doing, and that is a challenge for us. We rely on state spending for a lot of different programs. Increases in debt service payments just become even larger headache for the state. So again, remains to be seen what this means specifically in terms of the dollar figure for Connecticut and ultimately what actually happens with interest rates. But it's definitely something to monitor that could be a serious headwind for Connecticut as a result of these changes. Um, on the SNAP side, I think one of the big thing there has to do with administrative costs. So we're immediately going to see some increases in administrative costs for running the program in Connecticut. One of the big changes there as well is that there's potentially a large increase in required payments as a result of new penalties as a result of the error rate for the state. Connecticut has a we're in the top tier of the, essentially they have a tiered setup for how much of the amount of SNAP will the state have to cover, depending on the error rate that it has in terms of, and the error rate again is just, are you paying people correctly? Are people being able to utilize their SNAP benefits at a store? And if they do, are you overpaying, right? So those are overpayment and underpayments. Connecticut's one of the top tier in terms of doing poorly on that metric, and that could cost Connecticut if we don't get that under control, something north of $130 million a year. So it's nothing to sneeze at there, the amount that it could cost us. It is something that's relatively within our control in terms of being able to potentially bring down those numbers. And if we have a specific remedy in mind, the federal government does seem like they might have some leniency in allowing an extension. This would take place in 2027, I believe. It would give you a year extension, but that's definitely something to monitor for the state. On the Medicaid side, they changed what Medicaid can pay for. We paid about $14 million into Planned Parenthood, or the feds paid that into the state last year for their share of paying to Planned Parenthood. I would expect that Connecticut's probably going to want to cover that amount, and that's another $14 million there. The big question mark on the Medicaid side for the budget is what does the cut to Medicaid look like? How does the state respond? Right? The federal government on Medicaid takes about two-thirds, 63% of the cost sharing for Medicaid spending in Connecticut. If people lose their coverage because of work requirements, for example, and they're no longer eligible, will the state pick up the tab? And if they do, how much will that cost? That's obviously something for legislators to work out, but that's, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars a year, depending on how they ultimately decide to remedy that situation, what they think is appropriate. And again, the last thing is just ultimately other tax changes depend on and how it impacts our taxes, things like the uh, new car tax credit, things like the uh, changes to salt, things like that, or not salt, actually, changes to overtime, things like overtime and tips, no tax on tips. Whether those are above the line or below the line will ultimately impact the Connecticut state budget as well. I think all in all, what these changes to the state budget mean is just a greater level of uncertainty for individuals and businesses. If we have changes to taxes to cover some of these costs, that's ultimately something that businesses and individuals are consider when they're making investment decisions. And that's uncertainty is not the friend of economic growth. I won't go too much into detail here, but I think one of the other things on the economic side and why I think there's probably more modest economic uh, impacts as a result of this bill than maybe some people would expect is that a lot of these changes that are really expensive in terms of how they impact the budget technically are just extensions of previous tax law. So nothing is changing for a lot of people. So if you have, the individual income tax rates are staying the same, the standard deductions are staying the same in terms of what we would have been expecting over time. There are some minor changes, but ultimately the tax cut for a lot of people is relatively small, relative to what they've experienced the last few years. It's a large cut relative to what they would have experienced had they allowed some of these tax changes to expire. But from an economic point of view, that doesn't mean that you're going to get a bunch of extra spending as a result of these. The budget impact for the federal government doesn't necessarily immediately translate to changes to the economic uh, landscape in the state for most people. Economists would have already been projecting what the impact of an expiring TCJA would look like. But for an individual and for most people, it's just they were operating under business as usual, and now they just continue to operate under business as usual. And I think that's part of why we don't necessarily see a huge economic boost as a result of this bill. Da, da, da. I think one last piece that I didn't get into, estate and gift tax, Connecticut, again, just high income people likely benefit from that more. Connecticut has a lot of wealthy people that are passing on money. So again, it's just something to monitor. I would say the last thing, in conclusion for here, and I'm happy to take some questions and to chat if people have some other things if there are questions that came up during the presentation, but the big thing to consider is that near-term growth, I think, is where we're going to see the growth from this bill. In Connecticut, there are certain areas where I think that near-term growth in Connecticut will be disproportionately large for us. But the long-term issues that are created by certain cuts and expirations of certain provisions after a few years mean that those negative aspects of it will probably impact Connecticut disproportionately as well. So it's sort of a boom bust, even though this isn't a massive amount in either direction. Nonetheless, I think Connecticut in the near term benefits more than most other states, and in the long term, it works to the detriment. This bill works to the detriment of Connecticut compared to most other states. What remains to be seen, will the salt cap be changed a couple years from now to extend it? Will there be enough demand to try to extend it? We'll see. But nonetheless, those long-term cuts to services, those expiration of certain provisions mean that Connecticut is on the hook for a lot of money that we would rather not be, right? And so that's definitely a challenge for us. And the ultimate other wild card here is tariffs. When we're talking about deficits, we're talking about interest rates. That has to do with what our overall debt level is. Tariffs have brought in a lot of revenue to offset a lot of these things. I think, again, from an economist perspective, what I think this bill would worry an economist on is that it's essentially locking in those tariffs as a revenue source. Tariffs, again, tariffs are not a friend of the economist. There are certain instances where you would want them, but as a revenue source, they're a very inefficient revenue source. And so if they're being relied on for revenue to offset some of the costs of bills like this, what does that mean for the long-term fiscal health of the country, and how do we plan for, trade and things like that going forward? But again, those all remain to be seen on what deals look like, what Supreme Court decisions look like, and that's a major wild card going forward is how those tariffs ultimately remain or go away. And that will impact a lot of these projections. All right. Well, that was a lot, but I invite any questions people have. I hope that was helpful. Hope that provided some new insights for you all. But yeah.
Questions, anyone? We still have about 5 minutes, or we're at 4 now. If we could get some questions, even comments, additions, maybe to Dustin, what Dustin just shared with us. Feel free to
If
speak
anybody
or
has good advice for me to say to people when they ask me I've been presenting this, and so then people ask me tax advice, and I'm not a tax person by any means. I, get extensions and file things incorrectly all the time. So if anybody has a specific good guide, like good line that you use to talk about this, please let me know. I'd be happy to, spit that line.
got a quiet bunch this morning. Must be the weather, this gloomy weather.
I think so.
Wow.
Must be.
Okay, well, I guess we're going to be giving everyone back a few minutes of their day. Um, yeah, Dustin, we appreciate all this information you shared. Now, are these the slides? Are these something that you could share with
Yeah,
us?
absolutely. Hmm.
Okay, so send them over to me, and I'd be happy to share them with the group here this morning.
Yeah.
I can get those out to you.
That'd be great.
Great,
And please just follow along with us to the foundation. We'll be monitoring this as it goes, and we'll be publishing our own sort of economic analysis of it and the broader Connecticut economy as things develop. So please, if you ever have any questions, please reach out. April has my email, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
what's that? What's the website for the foundation, Dustin?
So if you go to cbia.com/foundation, that's where you'll find the foundation's website. And we're also on LinkedIn, CBIA Foundation, and that's where we share a lot of our information. You can also follow me on LinkedIn where I post a lot of the blogs and articles that I write and that we share from the foundation as well. So any of those places, definitely give us a follow, give us a like, and keep in touch.
Great. Well, I'll share that with everyone also along with the slides. So thank you again.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
All right, everyone. Have a great day.